Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk briefly about adolescent brain development and actually how our brain develops as well. So our brain actually develops from the back to the front. So our frontal lobes are the last to develop, and they're actually still developing up through your 20s or early 20s. So there's a new psychologist out there, James Guide, I think is his name, who's been doing some pretty groundbreaking research on adolescent brain development. And what he's been doing is using a pretty sophisticated MRI machine to map out cognitive development or brain development during adolescence and also during puberty as well. And one of the things that he has been able to show is that there's a huge amount of brain growth that happens during puberty and during adolescence. We used to think that, and I even told you, 85% of brain development happens from age 0 to 5. But there seems to be a huge surge of brain development as well during these adolescent years, which makes a lot of sense if you think about all the new cognitive skills that adolescents have. Their thinking ability is just really expanded, and that has to do with neural connections that are being made in their brain. So they're making all these new synaptic connections between neurons, and we're also getting rid of connections that maybe aren't being used or don't need to be used. And so there's this huge amount of brain development that occurs. And things can actually go awry during this brain development as well. So we know, and we'll talk about schizophrenia in the last couple chapters, but we know that schizophrenia occurs in the late teens, early 20s. And there is some evidence and some research that's showing that there may be something going wrong at this stage of brain development that causes people to have schizophrenia. We definitely know that schizophrenia is a disorder of the brain. The brain no longer functions correctly. The person's not able to think clearly, sees things and hears things that aren't there. And it's really kind of a deterioration of brain functioning. So it may be due to really aggressive pruning at this stage. And I already talked about the brain developing from the back to the front. So you think about it, your vision actually develops first, your motor skills develop, your hearing develops, your math skills and things like that. And then in the frontal part of our brain is really where more of the sophisticated thinking, judgment part of our brain is. So it's the part of the brain that weighs consequences, that actually controls our impulses, helps us make good decisions. It has to do with our judgment. So, and that prefrontal cortex, the very front of the brain, actually doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. So this is a 5-year-old brain here, and anything that's not purple or blue is not fully developed. Really, the purple is fully developed. So the red and the yellows and the oranges and the greens that you see here in the frontal part of the brain are parts of the brain that are just not fully developed yet. And you get to the preteen brain, you see a lot less red, a lot less orange, but you still see some. And then you get to that teen brain, and it's definitely, pretty well developed, but there's still areas that are not fully developed. And then you get to the 20-year-old brain, there's still a few areas that are not completely developed. So until the mid-20s. And then what about some of the other structures in the brain? So the amygdala, that emotional center of the brain, and it's actually the reward center of the brain as well. So the amygdala helps teens decide whether or not a situation is dangerous, exciting, or safe, and it's still developing in adolescence. So the adolescents' emotions are still not fully developed, and sometimes we see adolescents have like more intense emotion. Little kids have extremely intense emotions and have trouble controlling their emotions, and they get better and better as they get older. But adolescents almost feel emotions much more intensely as well. Whereas little kids tend to act out their emotions pretty in extreme measure sometimes. Adolescents tend to keep those emotions to themselves, but they really feel them in a really strong way. The amygdala also controls your fear response, your rage or anger response, and your sexual response too. And it's still interacting with that prefrontal cortex to sort of regulate itself, and that prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed, and the amygdala may not be fully developed. That's the reason why adolescents make some bad choices sometimes. And then you mix in alcohols, video games, drugs. The adolescent brain is being wired for adulthood, and And the things that we do all the time, those connections are going to get strengthened. So the more video games you play, the more strong those connections are going to be. But then you may lose connections that you really need in other areas. So it can become problematic. So if you don't use particular connections, they can get lost. And drugs and alcohol can definitely interfere with those connections being made. And certainly, if you've ever known anybody that's a heavy drug or alcohol user, and we're not talking just, once on the weekend or something, but we're talking about daily use, really frequent use, you realize that that person has missed out on some development, social development, emotional development, and cognitive development, not to mention just, life skills and development as well. So we know that it's a real concern when teens are using a lot of drugs and alcohol because it interferes with their development at that age, and they're missing out on that development, and they may or may not be able to go back and make up for that development. We know that adolescents do some crazy risk-taking behaviors, and they're intensely kind of focused on themselves. They often have real feelings of immortality. They're really ruled by their emotions or more controlled by their emotions, and they definitely have more risky behaviors. Do you think we should allow teenagers to have a gun? Do you think it's good that we have the drinking age moved up to 21? And I think with smoking, I think maybe they talked about moving it up to 21, but I'm not sure if they've done it. But it used to be 18. You can join the military at 18. Should you be able to make that choice at 18? These are all questions that we really should think about. And as we're thinking about the fact that teenagers' brains aren't fully developed and their judgment is pretty poor because their brain is not physically capable yet of making really good choices. This case you may or may not remember, but this happened a few years back, and these Michigan teenagers were bored and they thought it would be fun to throw some rocks over the overpass off the freeway. I think it was Major Highway, actually. And first they started throwing pebbles, and they thought it was pretty funny if they hit a car. And then they started, egging each other on and getting bigger and bigger rocks. And finally, one of them picked up a hunk of concrete and threw it over the edge, and it actually ended up going through the windshield of a car and killing a young father. And all five of these kids were charged with manslaughter. And, should they be tried as adults? Should they be treated as an adult? Certainly they committed a pretty horrific crime, but they weren't thinking it all through. So something to think about in our court system is looking at this and thinking about, should these kids be tried as an adult, or should they be tried as children and certainly suffer some consequences for the action, but should they be treated as murderers? I don't know. It's a question for you to answer, and it would be a great pat back question as well. Thanks for listening, and we will talk in the next video.